Chapter 1. B. Someone's coming. That line was muttered by my brother, the alpha of our pack, and his mate, Ellie, but no one needed them to say it out loud. We could all feel it. Something was coming whether we were ready for it or not. We'd been celebrating the solstice with a few friendly packs when this electric feeling began dancing along my skin. It zipped and zapped down my body, making my hair stand on end and my wolf sit up and take notice. Once the sound of the driveway gravel crunching beneath heavy footsteps reached our ears, the festivities ceased, and the mood turned deadly serious. Someone was heading our way, their intentions unknown, and we were all standing out here in our party clothes, completely unprepared. The alphas present gathered in front of the guests, my brother Abraham front and center. I cursed the dress and heels I had on as I took my place behind him and cautiously anticipated what came next. The clearing was absolutely quiet, which should have been difficult for a gathering of more than 100 werewolves, but they managed. I glanced behind me to make sure my sisters and Ellie were back where they belonged. They were all strong, and I'd taught each of them how to fight, but they weren't enforcers like the beefy men surrounding them, the beta or second in command like I was. It wasn't their job to protect. Closer than ever. That electric feeling was now stinging my flesh. It was so. The crunching footsteps were slow and steady as they made their way up them to eliminate this threat as quickly as it had appeared. Later. I'll admit, I usually leaned the opposite way, but my job was to follow. He had dark, disheveled hair, and from that far away I couldn't make out his. The man smiled, and something in my chest tightened the slightest bit. I heard your festivities from miles away, and it drew me here. You must be. I worked to dissect his words as my eyes traveled along the length of his body. A werewolf too. He didn't smell like one. Wolves ages 18 to 70. He couldn't have been older than 35. Himself. The strange man chuckled. Please excuse my poor manners. I am called Will. On this one. Attention, my entire world was focused on one single point. Dirty. They darted around the crowd huddled under the party tent. When they reached, just as quickly as he'd laid eyes on me, his gaze flicked away and I could. The way my chest heaved. I reached up a hand to soothe the ache that was only. Was this a lone wolf? So we needed to be wary. They were often. Most wolves lived in packs for protection and a sense of community. Although knowing Will wasn't part of a pack just deepened the mystery surrounding him. Don't believe you're one of us. You might smell a bit like a werewolf, but you can be a little disconcerting at first, but I assure you you'll get used to. Will had shifted one of his hands into a wolf's paw. See, he asked. Someone with that kind of power and control could be very dangerous. Of the other alphas asked. Ago I made a deal with a witch. What you see and feel today is because of that. Made a deal with a witch? Make a deal with one? I asked her to make me more powerful than I was. She chose to make me. The deal with the witch. Are you trying to tell me you're the original werewolf? My brother asked. Will was the original werewolf. The first of our kind. The very reason we all stood here today, modern day myth. And let the doubt and suspicion build in my head. Plans to get to the bottom of it before things went too far. Million years old is such a turn-off. She continued with a fake shudder. Truthfully, I wasn't surprised by the crass things that came out of her mouth. First of all, we don't even know if he is who he says he is, I said between setting an extra place for her at the dinner table without being asked. When my parents died and my siblings and I were forced from our home, Peyton came with us to Asheville to start over. I'd always assumed she'd grow out of. Prepared for the wrinkly mess I'll find in his pants when I finally get them. Something white-hot surged through my system and I worked to control my getting in his pants, Peyton. And shit, the guy just got here. Think you can. She sighed and looked toward where the alphas were still talking to Will. Think Abby would get mad if we hooked up? She asked, completely ignoring me. Missing. And you know that's not possible, she said through her teeth. That bitch. Peyton shrugged. I guess we'll see. Her gaze darted over my shoulder and, as it seemed, she'd been trying to break them up since the moment Abraham found Ellie in the woods bleeding and barely conscious. When I'd invited Peyton to our family dinner last Sunday, I'd had no idea what opposite effect on him and all of us was becoming family to me. I'd realized how awful I'd been and how much needed to change between us. Everyone, I realized she wasn't really so bad, and I'd had no reason to be so. And how Abraham belonged to her. I tried to reason with her, but she wasn't. Tentatively, As I scanned the crowd, I found Will sitting alone at a table. This man had trespassed on my pack's land, crashed our solstice party, and now... Chapter 2. Will. I can't believe it's the original werewolf. How is he still alive after all this time? I never imagined he'd be so handsome. The soft buzzing voices drifted through the summer air and I looked up, but all I saw were shadows. Gray. Black. White. That basically summed up my existence. Shadows and darkness and the same damn thing. Every day for years and decades and centuries and millennia. Nothing changed. Least of all me. I'd been the same for thousands of years. Not a single freckle on my body was any different today than it was on the last day of my old life. Or I guess you could call it the first day of my new life. But this wasn't any kind of life, so I preferred to think of it as the former. For a long time, I tried to find the good in each moment. The true, the pure, the beautiful. But centuries of that became tiring. You admire the petals of a rose? The buzzing of a honeybee? The crashing of the waves? How many times could you see the same things and still see them, instead of looking through them? I didn't know the exact answer, but I knew I was well past that point. Life. Now I live because I had no choice. I breathed because my lungs refused to stop working. My heart pumped blood. My life had become nothing but a reflex. I hadn't had one of those since I made a single decision that changed the ever seen. They were a clear icy blue that seemed otherworldly. Ethereal. Before? Tightened. It was subtle at first, but the longer I stared, the stronger. I'd never failed to heed. There was something different about this woman. Hello. Seat. A seat. I dug back into my food as I silently anticipated what she had to say. Did you actually make a deal with a witch? Have you met Elvis? Excuse me. What the hell are you doing here? If you even are who you say you are, witch. This pack. I don't buy it, and I want to know what you're really doing here. The fake grin earlier was so I'd appear less threatening. You think I'm lying? I set my fork down and crossed my arms over my chest. Her eyes danced along my. Why would I lie? Explorer from another galaxy for all I know. The corner of my lip twitched. Wouldn't I need a spaceship? Question. What are you doing here? At the time. That's all? You heard a party and decided to crash it. I don't believe you. She growled softly, which I found amusing. If you're the original werewolf, where did it happen? About 5,000 years. Give or take a century. What have you been doing all this time? I had been waiting for my existence to have meaning again. They seemed like genuine questions and not like the test she'd given me. Your pack. I dodged her question. To them, after all. I should be shunned, not welcomed. Now that was interesting. A female beta? Her eyes narrowed again. I won the position fairly. Hadn't bathed in weeks, hadn't had a proper meal or a bed to sleep on and all. That time either. I was a poor excuse for a man in that instant and for the... Don't make me regret this, Will. Another thing I wasn't used to feeling. Regret what? Why did that sound like it meant more than it really did? Like she wasn't just... I'll just be staying the night. She shrugged and stood gracefully from her seat. I knew then she meant what? Eloquence of a fighter. Someone that was intrinsically in tune with every part. Beneath her tight dress. Just don't fuck with my pack. I have no intention of harming anyone here. I hadn't fought or injured another wolf in centuries. I had no inclination to start now. I didn't catch your name, I said, breaking the spell between us. Like the letter? She shook her head. Like Beatrice. Finally she looked away and stood up straight. As long as we're clear, I frowned in her direction until she nodded toward the group of people. Thousands of times in the past. After the interesting and refreshing conversation I just had with Bea, the thought of talking to anyone else felt like a true chore. Tight dress that left enough to the imagination that I knew I'd be up the rest of the night thinking about it. But that too was a small price to pay. Bea. Like a hunter or forest or something. A green so dark it was hard to tell what. The lighter streaks and flecks of gold in his eyes. Eyes I hadn't been able to stop thinking about since I walked away from him hours ago. Could tell myself it was because I was still suspicious of him, but Will was gorgeous. Even with the layer of dirt covering him. He was fascinating. With a set of dark green eyes that I could spend days staring into. It was no wonder I couldn't stop thinking about him. Or sleep for that matter. But nothing was helping. Now, my next course of action was ice cream, and if that couldn't solve my problem, I knew nothing would. Just as the cold ice cream began to melt on my tongue, a door slammed upstairs, and I knew I wouldn't be finding any peace in this late-night snack. His beta. Sure seemed like I did an awful lot of that. I sat there waiting for whoever it was, and when they finally turned the... She'd been banned from the lodge after she'd poisoned Ellie's cat a few weeks ago. I'd half-heartedly stood up for her after that transgression because it hurt his mate's pet, and there was no excuse for that in his mind. Good. Eyes watery. Just realized I was there. Her pale face pinched with a sneer. Just seeing things clearly for the first time in a long time. I slowly rose from my stool at the kitchen island. What is it you're seeing? Your moron brother would rather chase after some human who doesn't want him. Sighed. You used to be my friend. Now you're on team stupid fucking human and I'm the bad guy. What the fuck is that about? Of my best friend and my brother winding up together. But it's obvious too. Worry I'm moving on. From him, from you, from this whole piece of shit pack. What does that mean? It means I'm not going to be your doormat anymore. It means I refuse to call that bitch my alpha. It means I'm leaving against my will, and I swear every Abraham lately, but I hadn't expected this. Hadn't really thought she'd take it so far that she'd get herself kicked out altogether. There was a time I'd have been upstairs in a flash, arguing with Abby over. I thought I'd feel sadder knowing my best friend since childhood was leaving. It's not really any of your business where I'm going, is it? She said, bringing me back to the conversation. Not like you give a shit anyway. Do you expect me to do right now? Nothing from you. Your cousin Calvin, on the other hand, he's been a real peach tonight. I think I'll get him a gift basket or something for his. Calvin? Didn't he give Ellie a ride home to Raleigh? That meant, but I really don't care. It's not my problem anymore. She turned around and headed toward the sliding glass door as my mind spun. She shrugged and looked at me over her shoulder, her dark eyes gleaming with something I was afraid to name. Oh, I'm sure you'll find out eventually. See. With that, she walked out of the lodge, and I knew then that something was. What the hell she meant about Ellie before it was too late. Chapter 3. B. I'll be up in a sec, I called after my brother, but I doubted he heard me. He was carrying Ellie up the stairs, the pack doctor and his wife trailing close behind. I watched them until they disappeared from view, my stomach twisting with worry. I'd have gone up with them if I thought I could be of any help, but I knew I'd just be in the way. I continued to stare at the empty staircase, hoping with everything in me that Ellie made it through this. Not only because I'd come to care about her, but also because if we lost Ellie, we'd lose my brother too. That's the price you paid for being fated mates. I pulled my short, dark hair into a ponytail to get it out of my face. Honestly, I was so exhausted I could have fallen asleep where I stood, but I knew that wasn't an option, so I made a pot of coffee instead. Thankfully, we got back to Asheville early enough that no one in the lodge was awake yet. I was not ready for the questions and concerns I knew were coming my way. I'd deal with them eventually, but right now I was still trying to process, to recover, to mourn. I stared at the carafe as it slowly filled with bubbling hot coffee, willing my mind to clear, but the intrusive thoughts wouldn't leave me alone. Flashbacks of what we'd seen in Raleigh, of what happened in Charlotte mixed. Ellie's going to be fine. Everything's okay. My family wasn't fine. We were irreparably broken. The back door. I was too cooped up in here. It was too warm. Too quiet. I needed some fresh air. I needed to think straight, and I couldn't do that in the crazed look in Calvin's eyes. And the early morning fog danced along the surface of the water like it did. I blew out a deep breath and my head fell forward as I tried to not let the wasn't going to happen. The first fact. My cousin Calvin had been the wolf murdering women and leaving. Turned so bad? What happened to him? What broke so irrevocably in his mind? That he would kill someone. And not just one someone but 8 someones. Calvin had not only been my family, but he was an enforcer. An officer of the had been forced to run interference more than once with nosy cops poking. But she'd been one of the lucky ones. Most humans didn't survive, and one of them as well, but none had been as fortunate as Ellie. When we'd realized something was wrong, we'd all raced toward Raleigh in that we were too late. Few good hits, but that pride paled in comparison to the dread that had seeped through my system. Calvin was not only twice her size, but he'd been an enforcer for years. Eating ice cream. It was unforgivable. How had he been able to fool every single one of us? Me, Abby, Calvin's twin brother, Clyde. Every single one of us had been Or how much worse it could have been if we'd been any later. Get home. It wasn't my life on the line. It wasn't my mate who was barely hanging on. There were so many people who had so many more reasons to feel worse than I. I sniffed hard and put on my beta face. The professional, self-assured mask I used when dealing with the pack. No one would follow a weak woman, so I heartache, but from his proximity. I looked into his dark green eyes, the ones that hadn't been far from my. I lifted my head to nod, but stopped myself at the last moment. For some, wouldn't believe me if I tried. I don't sleep much. I blew out a deep breath and looked away. I needed a momentary break from the intensity of his eyes and all the feelings they dredged up. Honestly, at this. Yes, it does have to do with that. We just got back a little while ago. Why did he want to know? He shrugged and looked away. His hand covered his chest in the exact same place mine hurt before he spoke again. Because I can feel your pain. I frowned at him, my mind racing. What do you mean you can feel my pain, Will? She took a deep breath and said, I watched my brother kill my cousin last night. I tried to hide my shock, but it wasn't easy. Werewolves were notoriously close-knit, within their packs and within their families. To hear that he'd find his fated mate. He's the reason Ellie's a werewolf now. Tonight, when he got the chance to be alone with her, he attacked and left for her place the moment we knew something was wrong, but we were too late. Chest aching as I watched this strong woman fight to hold herself together. Paused for a moment. We made it, but just barely. I took a step closer. I couldn't help myself. I couldn't stand back and watch. Absolutely unprepared to help her, but I knew I needed to try. Not. So I kept them clenched at my sides instead. I've never seen him like that, she whispered. I've never seen anyone like. And the look in his eyes. Her icy eyes swimming with tears, I longed to do more. He wouldn't stop. Her voice cracked on the last syllable and the ache in my. Tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. And he wouldn't stop coming. To make it. Fell from her eye before she wiped it away. Everyone around him. She folded her arms across her chest and squeezed it. Fact that my brother killed our cousin. Nothing can do that. Another tear fell from her eye, but this one she left to slide down the gentle. My people, everything that reminded me of her. I'd taken off like a coward and I grasped her other arm and pulled her closer until only a tiny sliver of space separated us. Her breathing turned shallow as her heart thumped louder. You keep going, I finally said. You grieve. You hurt. But you keep going. An extra moment to stroke her silky skin. Will, she whispered. In my arms. Looking into my eyes. Took a step back. I needed to remember who I was and where I belonged because. Bea shook her head and scrubbed at the wetness on her face. She glanced over. She nodded and took off in the direction of the lodge. But as she passed me, patiently waited for what came next. Will, she said again. My heart stuttered at my name falling from her lips. I watched her, hating every step she took, but knowing this was best for her. But Beatrice, she deserved the world. And as much as I despised the thought, I knew I'd never be the one to give it to her. Chapter 4. Will. No. I wrenched my body upright in bed before I was even fully awake. My chest heaved and my hands shook as the remnants of the nightmare slowly started to fade. Not that it was ever really gone. I'd had the same nightmare for 5,000 years. It was the oldest friend I had. I rubbed my face roughly as I tried to ground myself in the present, to remind myself of where I was, to remind myself that it was all in the past. Couldn't touch me anymore. But I didn't really believe that. I glanced at the clock on the wall to see I'd only been asleep for a few hours. Still, it was the longest rest I'd had in weeks. I swung my legs around and placed my feet on the soft carpet, my mind still trying and failing to forget about the nightmare. It always started the same. I'm with Adela. Remember her. But slowly, her face morphs and her body contorts. I try to hold on to comfort her, to do anything to make it stop, but I'm powerless. Useless. It ends as it always does, with her taking her last breath in my arms and me. Realize the consequences of what I'd done, and that I wasn't the only one who. It was so long ago, but the nightmare brought me right back every time. Sleep as little as possible. Chances were, I'd forsake my human form soon enough and live as a wolf again. Didn't have to think or feel or act human in that form. Best of all, I didn't have the nightmare when I was a wolf. In fact, I hardly Being a wolf came with all sorts of perks I'd been known to take advantage of, until I was nearly unrecognizable. More than once I'd almost lost myself completely to the beast. Some days I thought that would be a small mercy and, for my wolf and the peace it brought me, future treated the lodge was due in large part to the sweet woman who ran the. Today all I required was some caffeine and for the last dregs of the nightmare to dissipate from my mind. Brought me solace like so many others claimed, but it did little. Just like everything else in my life. Early, and I'd expected to spend at least a few hours alone. I thought about abandoning my seat in favor of the solitude I'd find elsewhere, but decided against it. The only thing that stood the test of time was me. And my guilt. Coffee maker. My eyes raked her form, my dick acknowledging the short robe she. Beatrice wasn't the same woman I'd spoken to yesterday morning. That woman had been sad and lost and even a little broken. But all that was gone. That over my own company any day. Coffee was definitely in order. With his mate tending to her needs while I ran the pack for him. It was more important that he take care of Ellie, but I'd had no sleep the clean up in the wake of Calvin's betrayal. All day. Images from the night before mixed with all the mistakes I'd made and things. Was only a few hours ago. Needed to get up and make sure this pack ran smoothly while Abraham was out of responsibilities. I rolled off my mattress, barely catching myself at the last minute before shoulders and shuffled out of my room. The lodge was quiet since it was still only the ass crack of dawn. Usually I made it to the kitchen, the tiled floor cold beneath my bare feet. Patting. A startled squeak slipped from my lips before I spun around, almost losing my footing in the process. At the other end of the kitchen sat Will, my favorite. And no, my heart wasn't racing because I was alone with Will again. It was mouth, and I watched silently as his throat bobbed with his swallows. He pulled it away from his mouth as my heart rate started to return to normal. I pressed my lips together to hold back my smile. Badass. He pulled it away from his mouth and held the mug toward me. Did you want that mug? The one he just had his lips all over. Was basically impossible. The aching in my chest that was always there when he. I supposed I should figure out what that even meant, but I was too tired. I stood there, one bare foot on top of the other, as I debated my next move. Craving, but that felt like admitting defeat. Why should I have to change my join me? Opposite him. With a generic coffee mug clenched between my hands, I sat there, racking my brain for something to say. About my feelings or get in touch with the inner Bea. I just needed to store all the shit that made me sat in a drawer in my mind and throw away the key. Coffee and back to my room before anyone woke up, so I didn't care how the privacy of my room. I embraced my feminine side and wore pretty things too. He'd already seen everything I had on display. And admittedly my brows rose on their own as I tried to figure out how to respond. He nodded once. Good. Or two before Will tossed back the rest of his coffee and stood. Considering the way he blew into my life, that wasn't too far from the truth. Question was, what kind of havoc would he leave behind him? Chapter 5. Listen up, fuckbags. I looked around at the group of enforcers and did my best to not notice the ones missing. One by choice and one as a result of his choices. One I understood, and the other's betrayal still burned hot through my veins. Despite the fact that most of you are all brawn and very little brain, I'm assuming you've noticed the men we're missing today. We're going to talk about it like little girls at a tea party for exactly 5 minutes, and then I never want to hear about it again. Got it? One of my enforcers, Callum, cautiously raised his hand. Did Calvin really kill all those women? The acid in my stomach frothed, but I grit my teeth and answered him. Yes. He turned to his brothers and shook his head. One of them spoke up next. But why? Colton asked. He was biting human women in the hopes they'd successfully shift at the next full moon and they'd be his fated mate. And before you ask, no, I don't know. Himself and everyone around him. I would have done the same. The words burned. My own family member or protecting the rest of my loved ones and pack the training. He slowly shook his head, eyes wide before they darted away from me. They were only voicing some of the dozens of questions circling my own brain. On repeat, but hearing them said out loud made things different somehow. More. Them could do that would really surprise me. But I'd been so wrong. Their tongues. Honestly, there were still 100 questions running through. Quickly, bringing with it a surge of stomach bile I had to swallow back. Revealing the sports bra I had on underneath and said, 200 burpees. Now. The men dropped to the ground immediately, and I followed suit. I didn't count days, or the deception, or the deceit, or the treachery. Heaving breaths, I let everything else slip away as I just focused on what I over and over as the sweat began to pour down my face and the numbers a brow in his direction, but he continued to just stand there. He cleared his throat. I wanted to go grab some water. Then I guess we're all not getting things we really want. Now get on my own set when I heard approaching footsteps. I turned and found my cousin. I lowered my voice. Clyde, no one's expecting you to show up for training. Hurt. Confusion. How much worse it must have been for Clyde. Rest of them are doing. My eyes. Stomach. The sounds I couldn't forget. The crazed screams that came from my cousin when we found him in that cottage. Begging to run rampant through my mind. Pleading to be set loose to destroy. The tiny sliver of control I still had on my emotions. Bent on destroying my brother's relationship with his fated mate. I'd hoped she'd snap out of it. That she'd let this vendetta against Ellie go. Unrecognizable. It wasn't as deep of a cut as the one Calvin had made, but it still stung. Will. She was magnificent. Again. Needed to watch the sweat drip down her silken skin up close. Bea sat up straight, her shoulders tense and her heart racing faster than count, she yelled. But she managed it with the ease and natural effortlessness of a born leader. And watch her strong body move up close were all bonuses. As the time passed, and the number of crunches we'd done rose higher, the men. Did you all wake up with the intention to piss me off? Bea yelled from her. 100 crunches instead. You really don't want to try me today. A little while later, once they counted all the way to 300, them. For it. In that moment she did. Hypnotized from my spot on the ground. Dispenser where the other enforcers were gathered. You don't want a drink? That. Hope so. 45 seconds. Continued like that for what felt like hours. She called out exercise after. Covered in sweat. Just when I thought we were done, she surprised me again. She took off running and I made sure I was at the front of the pack directly. Closer to her than they already were. Forest, the sound of the wildlife, the burn of my muscles, the rising and we made a large loop and wound up back in the clearing near the lodge. Half of. That's it for today. Try not to use up all the oxygen as you pull yourselves together. Help. Letting me participate today. She stood there for a moment before spinning around and walking away. Another enforcer called out. It didn't matter that my hands itched to trace her tight body or that my Chapter 6. Bea. What the hell? I breathed as I rubbed my aching chest. Thankfully, we were in between meals, so the kitchen was relatively empty when I snuck in. Miss Elsie was over by the sink prepping dinner, but I don't even think she'd noticed me come in, which was good because I needed a minute. I'd never expected Will to join one of my training sessions. Honestly, I don't even know how I got through it with him so close and messing with my equilibrium. And when he pulled his t-shirt over his head right before our run, I'd almost tripped over my own feet. His chest was chiseled in a way I hadn't expected. Defined muscles rippled across his golden skin as the sweat dripped down his body. To make matters worse, every time I tried to sneak a peek at him, I'd find him staring back at. But the biggest problem wasn't my physical reaction to him. He wasn't looking for Bea the badass beta, or Bea the strong sister, or even, why did he affect me like this? I'd been around strong, handsome men my whole them. I shook my head and pulled myself back together. I didn't have time to sit. I kept that smile on my face through sheer will. It'll be okay. We'll all. Until I could pinpoint the source. When I did, I walked over and knocked on. She narrowed her eyes. For what? Wasn't used to consoling anybody. No one came to me when they were upset. Her face crumpled. Getting hurt. She'd been close with Ellie since the moment they met. Asked quietly. I was his beta. He was my enforcer. I worked with him every this choice. I was sure he was nothing short of devastated. Them died, the other would too shortly after. I watched it happen to my that. About. Evie snorted behind me, but I ignored it. I reached for the handle, pausing. Evie reached up and returned my embrace, her small frame shaking slightly in. Pull out all the sadness and guilt and horror inside her and store it in me. When she pulled away, her smile was a little brighter, but her blue eyes were still sad, and I knew that wouldn't change anytime soon. I shot her a small smile and turned to leave, but when I got to her door, I for something like this, but you can always talk to me. You know that, right? Brother, stress wouldn't even begin to cover how he felt right then. I knocked on the office door and immediately heard, "Come in, Bea." I walked further into his office and took a seat on one of the chairs in front. He kept quiet, his face still planted in his palms, his large shoulders rising. "Broken Beatrice. How do you think she is? 2. Has Doc Monroe been by to check her out today?" I snorted. Ellie would not be a fan of that. Grew up with the man I considered my brother. No fucking way. We'll ever know. Killing all these women. And he trailed off, his throat bobbing with a. He didn't want you to see that. He was clearly really good at hiding his true. Follow me after all that. I waited until he'd settled down a bit to answer his questions. It makes you. I sat up straighter, squaring my shoulders and hoping some of my faith and confidence could be infused into him. That's why you have me. We're a team. We couldn't handle. I believe that with everything inside of me. Up with everyone I needed to yet. How's Ellie? Can I go check on her? I chuckled. Yeah, let me know how that goes. Get some video footage if you. Night. I frowned. For what? He paused for a moment before shrugging. Everything. Chapter 7. B. Fuck it, I growled. I was half asleep, half dressed, and halfway down the staircase when I felt that tight feeling in my chest. It meant Will was nearby, and if I had to guess, I'd say he was sitting in the kitchen where I'd found him yesterday morning, right in between me and my coffee. If I'd been a little more awake, I might have thought about the fact that I might run into him again and worn a bit more clothes. I looked down at myself and winced. Another lace tank top. Another small pair of silky shorts. But like I said, fuck it. We were werewolves. Nudity wasn't a big deal. Naked and ready to shift yet, but it was only a matter of time. The real question was, why did I feel more exposed in this tiny set of pajamas than I did fully nude? I shook my head to rid it of those thoughts. I wouldn't let Will make me into a spineless, insecure woman. No one could do that if I didn't let them. Morning, he said, his voice gruff and deep, sending chills down my spine. Getting my caffeine fix. However, once I got closer, my steps faltered and on the counter. I paused a second until I had my ridiculous heart under. He shrugged, his mug still clasped between his big hands. I would have made banging in my chest, so I tried to ignore it. I nodded at Will and spun around to fix myself a cup of coffee. I like it. Noted. Damn it. Beak it all. Son of a bee. Instead, I filled a bowl with oatmeal and cinnamon, grabbed my coffee, and word dug into my food. We sat there in companionable silence, me stuffing my face and him sipping on. I paused with the spoon halfway to my mouth. This was about the other day. I didn't want to talk about the weak moment I'd had when I cried in front of. Take an ice bath. An ice bath. Genius. I should have joined you. I raised a brow at him, my insides twisting and tightening as I imagined us in. What I meant was that was a good idea and I should have done the same. But by myself. In my own bath. Not with you in your bath. I should have done it. I could have commented on his rambling explanation or ribbed him for. He let out a deep breath. I'll do that next time. I arched a brow in his direction again. Next time. He nodded. Appreciated. With that, he stood up, grabbed his mug and empty. Wondering if he felt this pressure in his chest when we were close to Will. Stupid. 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 What the hell was I doing? Of Bea waking up several floors above me. Anxiously anticipating what color pajamas she had on today. Look sexy in them because trust me, she did. On them if I had to. Beatrice was off limits for me. There were no exceptions. And despite knowing better, I was going to wait right here and find out. I hadn't talked to her since yesterday morning when I'd made a complete fool. After that, she'd worked with her men, assigning them duties and making sure they were doing their jobs. She'd also had to deal with pack member after pack member and their issues. I'd also been working on making myself useful around here. I joined in with. Wasn't much, but I refused to take advantage of this pack's hospitality. I'd make sure the Asheville pack was compensated for letting me stay. Was the least I could do. Own mug and bowl of oatmeal to my customary table. I slowly sipped on the stairs. When she finally turned the corner and stepped into the kitchen, my heart. Morning, I said like always, lucky I was even able to force that single word. Morning, Will. Direction, I took a well-timed sip, determined to not show her how much she in it right there. I dragged my gaze away from her and studied my own bowl, using my spoon to stir the monotonous mixture. Head, grabbing her mug and bowl and walking over to me. Her eyes were wary as they watched me. Her lips twisted to the side like she was quiet for so long, but I refused to look at her again. I honestly. She nodded and shoved the spoon in her mouth. I watched her slowly remove it. No. Was the epitome of feeble. But that was ridiculous. Badly. But I did. Oh, she said softly. Silence stretched between us while I tried to figure out how to take back what. Paws glued to the ground, as I watched my cousin struggling in my brother's jaw. Reverberates through the small cottage, playing over and over and getting awake or asleep. Clasped my hands in my lap to prevent myself from reaching out for her. But that was not an option for me. She glanced up at me, her blue eyes so sad my chest squeezed even tighter. I nodded, but she didn't seem convinced. Events and move on. It won't happen overnight. You need time to process and mistake. Always gave, knowing how true it was whether she knew it or not. I'll see you. Or carry her to my borrowed room and do even worse. Offer, and I had to remember that. Chapter 8. B. Suicide Sprint. 2 at a time. Wes and Colton, you're up first. The two men lined up, crouched and ready to run. I blew my whistle and they took off down the field, stopping at the closest point before running back and starting again. Next time they ran to the second closest point and back. They did this at all 4 points before sprinting back to the starting line out of breath but smiling. Adding a little competition to our training was the smartest thing I'd ever done. Good job, Wes. Colton, try actually lifting your giant feet off the ground. Next time and maybe you'll win one of these. Colton's idiotic smile was still stretched across his face. You know what they say about big feet, Bea. I rolled my eyes so hard I swear I could almost see my brain. Yeah, it means your stupid mouth had to grow to fit your foot in it. Next. Tanner and Jason. Get ready. The next two enforcers lined up and took off as soon as I blew the whistle. Did my best to concentrate on the sprint in front of me, but that was almost impossible with Will standing less than 5 feet away. I did my best to be subtle as I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. For a change, he wasn't looking at me. Instead, he'd lifted his dark t-shirt to wipe the sweat from his face, exposing his defined stomach muscles. Wrenched my eyes away before I could get caught staring. By him or worse by one of these Neanderthals I called my enforcers. Tanner, I know your mommy might have told you that close enough was good enough, but not in my pack. You hit every line or you do it all over again. Your choice. He dug his feet in and pushed harder, ran faster, which was exactly what I was looking for. I called the next set of men and blew the whistle, watching as they took off down the field. Without my permission, my gaze jumped to Will again, only to find him looking back this time. I shot him a small nod and turned back around, my cheeks heating at being caught looking at him. He didn't seem to have the same problem. It didn't matter how many times I caught him staring at me. Didn't matter if it was up close like this or from far away. He'd still keep that intense green gaze on me for however long he wanted. Usually, I turned away well before he did, but there'd been a time or two I'd watched him right back, our gazes locked even from across the clearing. We'd been having breakfast together every morning for a week, and I really didn't know what to think about that. Despite my indecisiveness, I still showed up every morning, anxiously anticipating what he'd made us for breakfast. This morning it was veggie omelets. I tried to wake up earlier so I could make him breakfast for a change, but he always beat me to the kitchen. He'd said he didn't sleep much, and I guess that was true. I wondered if he even slept at all some nights. It was just another question out of dozens I didn't ask him. Felt too personal. And even though we'd both gotten really personal in the past, it had always been willingly. He'd chosen to tell me he didn't sleep because of nightmares. I'd chosen to tell him I'd been having them too. He didn't pry, so I didn't pry. So far it was working for us. And with as many skeletons as I had in my closet, I wouldn't be the one to rock the boat. All right, last sprint. Will, you're up against Clyde. Clyde was easily the fastest person in our pack, but I'd seen Will run and I knew he could take him. I also had a feeling he'd appreciate the competition. They both nodded and walked over to the starting line. Before they got there, Will paused, gripped the hem of his t-shirt, and pulled it over his head. Felt my eyes bulge before I looked away. Get a grip, McCoy. I really needed to get laid or something. A simple shirtless werewolf shouldn't send me into this kind of panic. I should have been impervious to naked men by now. But this was Will, the werewolf who called to something inside me, like there was a secret password to my deepest thoughts and feelings, and only Will had it. Didn't matter that I'd only known him a week, it felt like I knew him. And what was even stranger, it felt like he knew me too. Without me having to say a word. I didn't know what it meant, but I intended to find out. On my mark, I called to the two men lined up ready to run. I blew the whistle and they took off. Clyde had the lead initially, making it to the first line and back before Will, but that didn't last for long. The original werewolf growled and with a burst of speed, overtook my enforcer. His glistening muscles flexed, straining and contracting as he pushed himself even faster, even harder, digging his sneakered feet into the soft grass and propelling his body forward in an impressive display of speed. And I stood there, too consumed to yell one of my patented comments at Clyde, who was falling farther and farther behind. I was too wrapped up in Will, too transfixed by the way his muscles bunched and stretched beneath his golden skin. Will crossed the finish line first and slowed to a walk. His hands were at his hips as he took deep breaths and tried to regain his composure. Felt like I needed to do the same. I tore my gaze away from him to watch my cousin finish the sprint next. Clyde, did you get lost? He shook his head, chest heaving. He opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was another gasp for air, and I rolled my eyes. Save the excuses. I turned to the group of enforcers behind me. Everyone that won their heat gets to leave. Anyone who lost has to run a 5-mile sprint starting now. Groans as well as cheers sounded throughout the clearing, but I ignored them. The only thing I was focused on was Will, and the heated look he was giving me. From where he stood, I shook my head to clear it and clapped my hands. I'm hitting the showers, and I suggest the winners do the same. Y'all smell like a middle school locker room. A few chuckled and walked off while the losers caught their breath and stretched for the run ahead of them. Wes, hold up. You're on babysitting duty. The enforcer turned back around, mouth open to argue when I held up a hand. You're training to be the Gamma, and this is part of it. Shit rolls downhill. Buddy, time to grab a shovel. He rolled his eyes but closed his mouth, and that was the best I could expect from him right then. I'd ridden them all hard, and I was sure the last thing anyone wanted to do was run a 5-mile sprint, but that was too bad. Abraham and I had our suspicions about trouble brewing, and I needed every single one of my men in peak physical condition, whether they liked it or not. Get going, I yelled to the group and watched them take off for the woods. When I turned back around, ready for the shower I mentioned, I found everyone gone but Will. He stood there, shirt in his hands, sweat dotting his firm chest and that heat still in his eyes. My swallow was harsh before I put my tired feet to use and crossed the distance between us. Nice training session, he said as I got closer. I smirked. I don't think the other men would agree. He shrugged, his eyes not leaving mine for a single second. They're idiots. So you've noticed too? His lips twitched but the smile never came. In fact, I hadn't seen him smile since the night he showed up looking for a place to stay. It made me wonder about the man who had so little to be happy about. You didn't participate this time. I did every exercise with them. He nodded toward the lines I'd marked for the suicide sprints. Not this one. You were all paired up and I was the odd man out. Looks like there's an even pair now. I raised a brow at him. You want to go again? He shrugged. Since I'm tired, it'll give you a chance at winning. My jaw fell open. You're fucking on. His lips twitched, but that was it. Seemed like I was going to have to try lot harder than that to get him to actually smile. He tossed his shirt aside and we both walked over to the starting line. Turned to Will. You sure you want to go again? You're looking winded. He shook his head. Just focus on your own feet, McCoy, and worry about eating my dust when I beat you. Ah, you've never seen me race. I've watched you during the whole 5-mile run last week. I turned wide eyes toward him, my heart starting to beat faster. You should have been watching where you were going. He shrugged again. You were more interesting. I blinked at him slowly as my sluggish brain fought to catch up. Did he just compliment me? Was being interesting a compliment? I thought so, right? Ready to lose, he said, breaking me out of my thoughts. I scoffed and shook my head. We'll see. On 3, he said. 1, 2, 3. We both took off at breakneck speeds for the first marker. We reached it simultaneously and raced back toward the starting line. As we turned around, again he inched ahead of me, but I couldn't let that happen. As we made for the third lap, I dug deeper and pushed myself harder, maneuvering ahead of him by a hair. He growled from next to me and I smiled. As we began our last lap, our feet pounded against the lush grass as I pumped my arms and pushed with everything I had left. I was admittedly tired by now. I'd done almost as much exercising as he'd done today, and I was still having trouble sleeping at night. But this wasn't the time for excuses. This was the time to show him what I was made of, how I'd earned this coveted spot in the pack. It was through pure grit, and I had it in abundance. A growl rumbled up through my body as I reached into that last reserve of energy I had, pushing myself a tiny bit further. The finish line was within a few steps and I knew I'd won this race. So what happened next was completely unexpected. Large hands wrapped around my waist and tugged me backwards. I lost my footing and tipped over, my arms swinging wildly for anything to hold on to before I landed on something firm that said oof. With my chest heaving and my head spinning, I looked beneath me to find Will, just as out of breath, but with a small smirk on his face. Did you really just fucking cheat? I panted. What are you talking about? I spun around until I was straddling his abdomen, facing him. I was about to win when you grabbed me. I didn't touch you. You fell on your own. I blinked at him, my jaw hanging open as I tried to figure out if he was joking or legitimately delusional. Finally, that smirk turned into a full-blown smile. A straight, white-toothed, big-ass, panty-melting smile that twisted the knots in my stomach into a tangled mess I knew I'd never sort out. And goddammit, he had dimples. He was so beautiful it almost hurt to look at him. I'd had trouble keeping my distance up until now, but hell, if he'd been flashing that smile and those dimples around this whole time, I knew I would have caved already. In one swift move, he sat up, bringing us nose to nose and sliding me onto his lap. You'll have to be more careful next time. Next time? I asked, my voice breathy and so low even I could barely hear it. He shrugged. If you want. I kept my gaze locked on his forest-colored eyes and nodded. Edo. I swore the heat in his eyes at that moment should have singed my skin. It was so intense, and I was trapped in his gaze as a million words passed between us. In the heavy silence. Finally he blinked and looked away, breaking the spell. I did my best to take in even breaths, but I was still panting and hoping he'd chalk it up to the sprints we just did. His big hands wrapped around my waist once more before he lifted me off his lap and set me down on the grass next to him. He climbed to his feet in one agile move before holding out a hand for me. I steeled my nerves and accepted his offer. His palm was warm and rough, and it sent tingles up my arm and through the rest of my body. I'd have worried about my racing heart, but I knew there was absolutely nothing I could do about it right now. Not with Will's intense gaze still focused on me and his hand still wrapped around mine. He slowly pulled his arm back, fingers sliding through mine almost as if it was against his will. I thought my heart would settle down as soon as we weren't touching anymore, but that wasn't the case. And now that I was paying attention, I could hear his heart racing just as fast as mine. I knew then that despite how aloof he tried to seem, he was as affected by me as I was by him. It was comforting but also confusing. Where did we go from here? Will's eyes never left mine as he took a step back, and then another, and another, until he was far enough away that his earthy scent didn't cloud my brain anymore. He took a deep breath, his chest inflating and flexing in the bright afternoon light. With a shake of his head he said, "I'll see you around," and walked away. I watched him go, wondering what exactly was going on. It was clear there was something between us, but any time I got the chance to peek behind the mask he wore, he withdrew and walked away. I'd seen more of his backside than any other side of him. So where did that leave me? Currently that was alone with a racing heart, tingling fingers, and a stomach full of knots. I didn't know why Will kept walking away from what was so obviously between us, but I knew I needed to find out, and maybe get him to stick around for a change. Chapter 9. B. Are y'all coming down for dinner? My youngest sister yelled through Abraham's office door after pounding on it with her tiny yet mighty fist. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like being an only child, I said softly to my brother. I heard that. Or to move out of the lodge and into a pack house by myself. I continued. I don't think so, Beatrice, Evie said from the hallway. I pressed my lips together and waved a hand toward the door, giving Abby the opportunity to answer her. We'll be down in a minute, Evie, he said in his normal tone, knowing she'd hear it anyway. Okay, I'll see you two down there. I thought she'd walk away, but she stuck around to add, and you'd miss me, Beatrice McCoy. Wouldn't? My brother chuckled as her steps retreated down the hall. I don't think Evie would let you have a chance to miss her. Me. But she's right. You would miss her. I shrugged. I guess we'll never know. Into the concerned frown he'd been wearing before Evie interrupted us. My sources don't have much new information. What about yours? To some of them recently, in light of what happened with our cousin and Uncle A, of his son go unpunished. We just didn't know how or when he tried to do something about it. About it? A new girlfriend? I almost retched just thinking about my fat, sweaty old uncle with a girlfriend. Hell, I hope not. How many wives can one man disappoint? Abraham chuckled. True. I just wish we had more information about what was dinner. No news is good news. If he was preparing to move against us, damn. He was right. If Conrad chose to, he could quietly send a dozen men to our lands, and if then we ramp up patrols. We'll keep checking in with our sources. We'll make sure we're prepared for whatever he throws our way. Confirmation. If we knew what we were up against. Shot me a narrow-eyed look that I ignored. We're doing everything we can do now. But his enforcers outnumber ours 3-1. We can't win against odds like that. Well, we can't just make people join our pack. Like who? Grady, Bryson, and Adam, to name a few. Plus we could look further east too. I'm sure Bryson has connections out there. Let's keep that idea on the back burner for now. We don't know anything yet. He sighed and ran a rough hand down his face. I know. You're right. I swallowed once and nodded, knowing exactly what he was talking about. It was still alive. Probably longer to get over the fact that he was dead. I knew. I was still struggling with it. Nah, I'm gonna call Elle real quick. She's moving out here this weekend, right? His face stretched with a wide smile that I had no choice but to return. His eyes widened as they met mine. Yeah. I shrugged. Of course. My pack needs something and I'm there. You should know that you'd react to her moving out here. I sighed and let my arms drop by my sides. I know I was a bitch to her, Abby, but I've apologized. I'm happy for you that she'll be out here permanently, and I'll be happy to have her around. I've got no hard feelings and I hope she. My brother's lips curled into a smile again, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I snorted. Actually, I just got my head out of my ass. I could say Peyton influenced a lot of my feelings towards Ellie, but I'm my own woman. I made that smile of his turn soft. I know you are, Bea, and I appreciate it. I nodded and stood up straight, sick of the mushy shit. I'll let you call your mate now. See you downstairs. And if the conversation turns dirty, do me with a shudder. I'm going. I left my brother and all thoughts of him and Ellie behind, honestly thinking I was happy for him, but I didn't need to know anything about his love life. Not one thing. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I pulled it out I couldn't help the Johnny. Is this Saturday still good for you? Damn it. I'd actually met him during the solstice party. He was a little older and a lot handsome, which was exactly my type. He'd also been funny and somehow he'd talked me into giving him my number and letting him take me to dinner. We'd even set a day, but with everything that happened after the party, it totally slipped my mind. Lucky for me, I had an excuse to bail. Sorry. I went to shove my phone back in my pocket when it vibrated again. Johnny. Then how about next weekend? Double damn. To delve too deeply into why that was, but there was no ignoring it. And that reason was Will. Even just thinking something so stupid irritated me. I wasn't seeing Will. He'd never expressed any interest in dating me, so why didn't I want to go out with this perfectly nice guy? Worst of all, why did it feel so wrong? All we did was have breakfast together, and occasionally share our deep, dark secrets, but that was all. There was nothing between me and Will, and I needed to remember that. So I started tapping out a response. Me, that works for me. My thumb hovered over the send button, but I didn't press it. Instead, I deleted those words and wrote different ones. Me. Let me see what I have going on and get back to you. There. Non-committal without being rude. Now I had plenty of time to figure out if I go on this date out of spite, and if I said yes right now, that's what I'd be doing. Letting him take me to dinner to prove to myself I wasn't hung up on. I needed to cut that shit out ASAP. But I couldn't deny there was something between me and the original werewolf. There was this physical reaction that couldn't be ignored. I'd never met anyone who affected me like that. So intimately. I didn't know if I'd ever know what it meant. But what it didn't mean was I had any claim on him or vice versa. We were two single people, and if Johnny wanted to take me out on a date so bad, I should really let him. What did I have to lose? To the kitchen, I beelined for the table of food and quickly filled a plate. Before grabbing a glass of water, I turned to scan the room for my sisters, when another sight stopped me in my tracks. Will was eating by himself at our normal breakfast table. Later or not at all, but he was never around for any meals except breakfast. And that was first thing in the morning. But there he was, messy dark head, bent over his plate, seemingly oblivious to the room around him. How could he not notice the talking and laughter that surrounded him while he sat there by himself? I figured the other residents of the lodge were either too intimidated to sit with him or just didn't care enough to join the man of this lively room. My earlier thoughts swirled through my head, looking for him wherever I went and get over whatever this odd thing was. Between us, we were just two people who had breakfast together, and that was all. Except I was about to also share a dinner with him. About to do would raise just about every brow in the room, but I didn't care. There was no way I was letting Will continue to sit by himself. I tipped my chin up and marched across the room toward our table like I did. Room was full of people, every pair of eyes on me. I didn't ask to join him. I didn't say a single word as I sat down in my usual seat and placed my food in front of me, without waiting for his. I looked up at him, my mouth full of chicken and potatoes and gravy. Lowering his voice, I said, "What are you doing?" I looked down at my steaming plate of food and back up at him. Eating. He shook his head, lips pressed into a firm line. "I mean, what are you doing here with me?" He blew out a frustrated breath and dropped his voice even lower. "I don't need the company." "Okay," I said slowly. "Let me rephrase, I don't want the company." My stomach hollowed out as my heart fell into its depths. I swallowed the food, but I willed them to still. I would not react. He would not see how deeply his words affected me. "Okay, then leave," I said quietly, silently daring him to shove the final. Wouldn't be the one to tuck my tail and run. He watched me silently for so long as I resolutely avoided his gaze. Finally, he shook his head, grabbed his dishes and stood up. Without another word, not even an "I'll see you around," he walked away from this, whatever this was, Will's retreating form, and my still one. I wanted to get up too, throw out my dinner and just walk away. It would look weak to my pack, but then I wouldn't have to feel their stares, or toss a biting remark at Will's back. Get out some of the anger brewing just beneath the embarrassment that ran rampant through my system. Even though that first scenario, pretend like nothing happened, pretend like my insides weren't in turmoil, or that Will hadn't hurt my feelings deeper than I thought he could. I'd only known him a little over a week. He shouldn't have been able to affect me so. Unfortunately, the last choice was the only one I could live with. I wouldn't run away. I wouldn't give in to the rage coursing through my system. I'd sit here with my head held high and my insides a squirming dark mess. And as soon as I was done, I'd be free to escape to my bedroom and do whatever took to forget this ever happened. It was unlikely, but I'd try anyway. I guess one good thing came from this disastrous dinner. Now I knew what I was. Chapter 10. Will. "No," I yelled as I wrenched my body upright, the single syllable echoing through the sparse room. My breaths were ragged as they escaped my lungs, and my hand still shook as the nightmare slowly started to fade. But it was getting worse. This was the 5th night in a row that I'd woken up screaming, my throat raw and aching. Thankfully, it would be good as new in a couple hours, but that didn't change the fact that I'd wind up doing the same thing again the next night. Lying back down, I worked to even my breaths, to clear my mind and let the nightmare go for a few hours at least. I knew by now nothing would make it leave forever. The only reprieve I'd ever get would be a few hours at a time, but I'd take them. A door softly closed upstairs, and I squeezed my eyes shut as I listened. Steps were light, but I could still pick them out as they padded down the stairs and into the kitchen. The hissing of the coffee machine reached my ears next, and I opened my eyes to stare at the ceiling above me. With her I could have been enjoying a few minutes of normalcy with the first person to fascinate me in millennia, maybe ever. That would never be conquered, and counting her heartbeats. Time to remember why I needed to keep my distance. Beatrice McCoy was not for me. She was sweet and tough and kind and funny, and she had no business with. Couldn't escape. Someone so damaged they found it easier to live as an animal than a human. But damn it, I couldn't get this image of her out of my head. It wasn't her heart-stopping smile or even the mischievous smirk she sometimes flashed me. The moment I took what little we'd built and demolished it. I ran my hands roughly down my face as my stomach twisted at the memories. Mistake. It had been full of the lodge's occupants, their boisterous talking and laughter almost deafening compared to the silent solitude I was used to. Feel their pity. It made me chew faster, swallow quicker, do anything it took to get out of. And then I felt that ache in my chest that always prefaced her arrival. She started heading toward me that the panic began to mount. Every step she took in my direction was another mistake I'd made, and they were stacking up. All people in horror for the same reason. Stayed a few nights and then wandered elsewhere. It was what I'd been doing for centuries. Until now. Until Beatrice. She made me want to stick around. She made me want to get to know my fellow. Time. She'd sat down without a word, drowning me in her intoxicating scent, which her proximity, and I knew then what I had to do. I just hadn't imagined how hard it would be. When I'd said I didn't want her company, it was one of the boldest lies I'd other option. Things had already gone too far, and I hadn't realized it until that moment. Connection was one-sided, but when she'd forsaken her family and friends to sit with me that night, I'd realized just how far things between us had gone. Beatrice was like the sun, this bright beaming orb spreading warmth wherever she went. And I was a dirty shadow cast by some decrepit and condemned. It was selfish spending all these mornings with her. I'd known that at the something even close to what I felt, I'd have put a stop to it sooner. But now the damage was done, and it was too late to take it back. Aftermath of a crowded room and countless eyes watching our every move. It was an asshole thing to do, but I just add it to the list of terrible shit I'd done in my life. A list I obsessed over often. Myself out of bed. The sleepless nights were starting to catch up to me, but there wasn't much I could do about that. Simplicity of that life called to me, but I'd hold off for now. I'd only been a man for 2 weeks. It wasn't time to throw in the towel just yet. But the farmers of the Asheville pack didn't seem to mind. Help was help after all, and I did my best to make myself as useful as possible. Barely allowed breaks and did nothing himself. When he finally relented and allowed 30 minutes for lunch, the farmers scattered while I took my time. It wasn't like I had anywhere to be anyway. Training grounds. My chest squeezed tight as I laid eyes on Beatrice. She was doing running lunges, her lithe frame making the exercise look easy. When I knew it was anything but. I stood there watching her for a long time. To be back at the farm, but I couldn't make my feet move. She was magnificent. So strong and fit, her body moving effortlessly across the field. I noticed something though. With how hard she was pushing herself, it would only be a matter of time. I stood there, hands fisted at my sides as I watched her incorrectly lunge. I crossed the distance between us, my eyes never leaving her. I wondered if her chest was squeezing as tight as mine was as I got closer. When I was finally near enough to speak, I called out, "You're going to hurt yourself." She didn't pause, didn't look up, didn't even acknowledge that she'd heard me, which bothered me more than I thought it would. To pull something. Still she ignored me. All at once she twisted out of her lunge and spun to face me, chest heaving from exertion and her hands on her hips. "Oh, are you talking to me again?" I tried not to let the sound of her voice affect me, but truthfully She scoffed. "Right. I didn't." "Whatever, Will. What do you want?" I tried not to show it, but the venom in her voice almost blew me back a step. "It's not." I shrug. "I don't want you to hurt yourself. But why do you care? Why would you ignore me for days and then walk all the here?" I opened my mouth to speak but closed it just as fast. Despite how aloof I'd tried to be, she'd seen right through me. Through every wall and pretense I wanted to stick to my weak excuse of not wanting her to get hurt, but knew that lie wouldn't pass. Not with Beatrice. She was too smart, and despite my best efforts she knew me too well. She rolled her eyes, head shaking, before letting her arms drop to her sides. I tried to ignore the way my arm tingled where she touched me, but that was away, but it didn't look like that was going to happen either. It seemed like I was doing more harm than good. I'd been unable to ignore this thing between me and Beatrice, and this was where it led me. To a woman I couldn't stop thinking about, couldn't avoid despite my best efforts, but one. Maybe I'd be better off as a wolf after all. That's how long it was before I saw her again. But not for lack of trying. I'd kept my eyes peeled for her inky hair or bright blue eyes all weekend, but it seemed she wasn't on Packlands. I did my best to eavesdrop whenever was getting ready to move in. I figured Beatrice's absence had something to do. It bothered me that I hadn't seen her in so long. It bothered me even more with anyone, and the possibilities kept me up at night, which was a welcome distraction from the nightmare. Wanted to admit when I found Bea over by the training grounds running her weekly session. I yearned to join but knew I wouldn't be welcome. Without Bea's companionship, I felt more like an outsider than ever. Most of the wolves were too intimidated to speak to me, and the ones that weren't had nothing but meaningless questions to ask. My life had become monotonous and dull without Beatrice. You'd think I'd be. Beatrice McCoy had turned my life upside down. But none of that mattered. It didn't matter that I couldn't stop thinking about her or that my hands itched to trace her tight curves. I couldn't have her, and I needed to accept that. Lodged to have lunch alone. I still hadn't made any real connections in this pack besides Beatrice, but now that didn't matter either. I'd be moving on from here soon enough, and the less people I had to miss, the better. But I didn't leave. I didn't pack up my meager belongings and move on like I'd been promising to. Lay in bed listening to Beatrice having her morning coffee and wonder how I could walk away. The thought of never seeing her again, never staring into those fathomless blue eyes again, sat like a boulder in the pit of my stomach. I didn't know how I'd ever move past it, but I knew I had to. I was nothing but I saw the way she looked at me when she didn't think I could see, just like I knew she could feel me watching her whenever she was in eyeshot. We were like two ships passing in the night, and if we got too close it would be. So the only option was to leave. Soon. I swore the only reason I stayed the rest of the week was to help the farmers. The fact that I got to watch Bea training every afternoon while I ate lunch on the back porch was just a bonus. At least I'd kept my distance from her. I'd missed all regular mealtimes. Anything I could to become the wallflower I was meant to be here. The hardest part of all was ignoring the tightness in my chest that never seemed to go away. It might lessen and become more of a nuisance than an ache. Between me and Bea, I was just too chicken shit to find out what it was. Despite the many mistakes I'd made in my life, I was determined to do the right thing here. And that was to stay away from Beatrice McCoy. Chapter 11. Will. Somehow another week flew by and I was still in Asheville, North Carolina. I could feign ignorance and say I didn't know why I stayed, but the truth of the matter was I couldn't make myself leave. I couldn't face the possibility of never seeing her again. It didn't matter that I wouldn't touch her or even talk to her anymore. Was another lie I was telling myself. Since the day before. Usually I found a secluded spot to watch her during my moments later. She pulled up to the lodge in the passenger seat of a luxury me, which of course meant nothing. Silver streaked through the dark hair at his. It didn't reach her eyes. Soaring. I didn't care that I was being irrational. It was wrong, and I was off its hinges and dragged him out of the truck. Dormant for centuries. Nothing could stop him now. Will. Stop it. What are you doing? Bea screamed. She was closer than before. My hand shook as I stood there trying to rein in the beast inside me. Underbrush. Will. Have you lost your fucking mind? Her jaw was clenched, hands fisted at her. Was still set in a stubborn tilt as she spoke. We just went on a date. That's not how it looked. Should take what isn't his. The last of my willpower vanished, and I surged forward, backing her against. Can have. I stared at her mouth, wondering if it tasted as good as I thought it would. Thankfully, she didn't call out to me because I'm not sure I could have kept. Like running away. Did something I couldn't take back. To let go, but I was wrong. I'd never been this out of control of myself, and I knew that didn't bode well. Worse. Bea. My hand still shook as I watched the place where Will disappeared from view. Ignored him. I was still so overwhelmed by Will that I couldn't focus on. My whole body tingled as I remembered how it felt to have him so close. To Bea. Course I'm okay. That was nothing. Last seen Will, I turned back to Johnny. I'm so sorry about that. With a sigh, I turned back toward the lodge, hoping Johnny would follow. You. Johnny scoffed from next to me as he caught up. It was just a kiss, Beatrice. Kiss I didn't consent to. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it. Like he was brushing off my was allowed to be okay with. I grabbed his arm and twisted as I spun around and pinned it behind him. The fuck? He continued to struggle in my hold, so I did what any sensible werewolf woman. I broke his wrist. Recover. Huxley, Matthias, make sure my date makes it off Packlands. Toward the man still whining on the ground behind me. Holy fuck, I'm so glad she turned me down, Hux muttered as he passed. It's my bedroom. Once there, I ran a still shaking hand through my short hair and leaned against the door. Seemed to be avoiding me. Overall, not one of my better days. I straightened up with a sigh and started pulling off my clothes. A run. Settle for a scalding hot shower instead. I pulled the towel off my wet hair and tied my bathrobe shut as I hurried to. My heart leapt to the back of my throat when I opened the door and found Will. Will surged forward, wrapping one hand around my waist as he slammed the door. Behind him, he spun us around and pushed me up against the wall as I got to feel his hard body pressed against mine for the first time. Ignore it. Instead of answering him, I tipped my head back further to meet his gaze. Will. His mouth met mine in a powerful kiss that surprised me so much I gasped. Will's hand instantly wrapped around my thigh, his fingers rough as they grazed my smooth skin. It felt like it burned wherever he touched me, but it was a fire I'd gladly endure. He rested his forehead on mine again as we both fought to catch our breath. Voice breaking the silence between us. The hell just happened?